Before we start, we want to big up New Scientist Live, our award-winning festival of ideas and discovery.
It's the ultimate place to expand your mind and feed your curiosity, and it's returning to Excel London on Saturday the 12th through Sunday the 13th of October. Over 80 exhibits, over 70 incredible speakers across 5 stages. It's everything you love about science, technology, and the world around you.
If you can't make it to London, we'll be live streaming the talks so you can join us from the comfort of your own home and hear some of the world's most interesting people as they discuss everything from the Big Bang to mental health, the magic of mycology, and the world's biggest flowers. If you're curious about life, the universe, and our place in it, there's a talk for you at New Scientist Live.
For more information, visit newscientist.com/NSLivePod.
Hello, welcome to your weekly dose of essential science news from New Scientist. I'm Rowan Hooper, and with me this week is my colleague Sophie Bushwick.
On the show this week, we have the world's oldest cheese and its connection to synthetic biology, plus a collaboration between octopus and fish, and the latest on microplastic pollution and what we know about its impact on our health.
That's coming up, but first, a few years ago, I wrote about some pretty outlandish ideas on geoengineering to refreeze the Arctic. And we've reported a lot on the podcast about the loss of ice in the Arctic and how it's accelerating. And look, the whole scenario is so nightmarish that some of these outlandish ideas have been developed further. Madeleine Cuff is here to tell us the latest. Maddie, you've got hold of some results of a field trial from a startup that's been conducting experiments in the Canadian Arctic. So, but before we get into that, why are we even talking about refreezing the Arctic?
Hi, Rowan. As we mentioned that we have reported on lots before, the Arctic is one of the fastest warming places on Earth. It's losing ice at a rate of 12% a decade. That's really staggering. And the loss of ice is kind of fast becoming unstoppable. Scientists now think that even if we started cutting our greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, it's already too late to save summer sea ice in the region, and that's predicted to disappear by the 2030s. So in short, it's become common to describe the Arctic as being in a death spiral, which is a cheery phrase. So if we can't take action on emissions to save sea ice, then the only other chance we've got is to find some way to kind of artificially keep the region cold while we play catch up with emissions cuts. And the idea is that then once we have stabilised climate change, i.e. we have reached global net zero emissions, we could then gently withdraw our freezing technology from the Arctic, having bridged the gap, so to speak.
And just to fill in on why it's bad if the ice disappears, there's this phrase, isn't there? Have you heard, the Arctic's not like Vegas, because what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a kind of jokey phrase that underlies, as usual with climate science, quite a serious point. So not only is losing the ice in the Arctic really bad for the wildlife and the Inuit communities that depend on it, but it will also trigger a series of really bad global feedbacks that will make climate change a much worse problem for the rest of us. So to kind of sum those up very briefly, for one, we really depend on the white caps at the 2 poles to reflect heat and sunlight back into space. So if we lose the ice in the Arctic and the ice is replaced with darker oceans, that means the Earth will absorb more heat and start to get warmer more quickly, and that will accelerate climate change. There's also the threat of sea level rise from melting ice and the release of huge quantities of planet warming methane, and then the slowdown, even potential collapse, as we've discussed on this podcast before, of global ocean currents.
So we probably should do something about all of this. And the company you've written about is called Real Ice, and they're working on an idea dreamed up by this guy called Steve Desch from Arizona State University. And I met him a few years ago. And his idea, right, wasn't it, is to use windmills to pump water up from underneath the ice and spray it onto the top of the ice where it would freeze and make the ice thicker, right?
That was his basic idea, and he actually came up with it as a bit of a thought experiment. It was his class of graduate students that they were kind of kicking ideas around to see what could we do if we wanted to stop ice melt in the Arctic? And this is the plan they came up with, to pump seawater from the bottom of the ice up onto the top so it freezes. So now this idea from Desh has been taken up with his support by a British startup called Real Ice, and they've tweaked the original idea a little bit. Instead of using windmills, their plan is for a fleet of underwater drones to swim under the sea ice and kind of poke holes in it from below, and then pump water onto the surface of the ice.
And it sounds like this is about strengthening the ice that's already there. So is the idea to make it help it survive the summer?
Yeah, that's exactly right. To strengthen the existing ice sheet. So usually sea ice will gradually form by freezing from below. So it will rely on the cold from the Arctic air during the winter penetrating through the ice and triggering the kind of growth of ice on the underside of the ice. So if you pump water from the sea up to the top of the ice, it basically speeds up that thickening process, because when exposed to the cold Arctic air, the water will freeze within hours pretty much. And the interesting thing about Real Ice's concept is that there's a potential double effect. So sure, if you pump seawater on top of ice and then that water freezes, you've quite simply thickened the ice. But if you pump the seawater onto ice that's got snow on top, you essentially have flooded the snow and turned that snow into ice. Now, snow is an insulator. So once you've turned that snow into ice, you've reduced the insulating properties of the ice, which means the cold can penetrate more quickly down to the sea, triggering the faster growth of natural sea ice.
This all sounds great in theory, but does it actually work? The team have been doing some real-world tests, right?
Yeah, that's right. So Real Ice has been working with the Centre for Climate Repair, which is a branch of the University of Cambridge in the UK. And they went up to, coincidentally, Cambridge Bay in Canada in the Arctic Circle earlier this year and started pumping water from one hole in the ice over an area of sea ice about the size of a football pitch. And that was over the course of a few weeks in January. And they went back in May to find out how much their work had thickened the ice sheet by, and the pilot revealed that they had added 50 centimetres of ice compared with a control site. And crucially, the results showed that their technique did trigger that extra ice growth on the underside of the sea ice. So the theory that you would reduce the insulating properties of the ice was proved right.
Before we get carried away on this one football pitch sized bit of ice, there is a lot of ice to cover, isn't there? And so this is a tiny scale field trial, and they've got to build this drone that's going to operate, or thousands of them. What are the chances of this?
Yeah, I mean, it is really small scale. It's incredibly early days. They say they need to do a few more years of tests before they can kind of even publish scientific papers. But Real Ice, if you talk to them, do insist that, yes, the basic idea works. They've proven that the physics are correct, and now it's about optimizing the process, so working out exactly when and where you should pump, how long you should pump the water for. And in terms of building the drone, it does sound far-fetched, but actually they've got experts in electronics and engineering working on the team, and they say that actually the technology to build these drones is already out there, and that's kind of one of the most straightforward parts of this puzzle. The next steps are really to kind of validate the idea, do some more tests, do some impact assessments, and have a prototype drone ready. And they reckon they can do all that in just a few years. And at that point, then it's kind of up to governments to decide whether or not we really want to go through with this.
And do they have would they have a best case scenario? If it all works and it gets to go ahead, how much would they decide to do?
Yeah, their idea of a full-scale deployment is about 1 million square kilometres of coverage. So that's about a quarter of minimum Arctic sea ice extent at the moment. And to do that 1 million square kilometres, you would probably need 500,000 drones, and it would cost about $6 billion a year.
That's quite cheap. Even a rich person on their own could have potentially afford that. But who would pay, do we think?
So I think in Real Ice's eyes, the ideal solution is that this is paid for by governments via an organisation like the UN, so that there's kind of collective buy-in for this action. One of the other options is that one country with Arctic geography decides to pay for it themselves, or you could have cooling credits that companies could purchase to fund Arctic restoration projects in the same way that you can, buy rainforest credits today. But and it's a pretty big but. This is a really controversial idea and not everybody is on board. There are loads of scientists and plenty of politicians and other stakeholders that are very sceptical of any kind of geoengineering, even when we're talking about quite specific actions like refreezing ice in the poles. And I think that's partly because there are still quite a lot of unknowns. I spoke to one scientist who said there could be some unintended consequences of thickening the ice sheet in this way. We could be disrupting polar wildlife, for example, or changing plankton cycles in the ocean by changing the density of the ice sheet. And also some people are just instinctively against this kind of thing because they think we should be focusing all of our efforts on cutting emissions and anything else is a distraction from that challenge.
Yeah, I do get all that, but it's weird, it's quite stark now that we're in this position where we haven't cut emissions and even if we do, it's going to melt. So it looks like we have to intervene if we want to save it. And I don't think we've really couched geoengineering arguments like that quite starkly before.
Now, we already know that octopuses are amazing animals, but we keep discovering more surprising things about them. This week, it was reported that octopuses and fish hunt together in packs, with the fish scouting out prey for the octopuses. What's more, the octopuses also seem to recognize that some fish are not pulling their weight, and they punish those fish by punching them. Michael LePage is here. Michael, what is going on?
Hello. Yes, so we're talking here about the day octopus. It's called that because it hunts in the day, surprisingly enough, which makes it much easier to see what it's up to for us humans. It's also pretty common in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, so it's found all the way from Hawaii to the Red Sea where this study was done. Now, it's been known since the 1990s that a single day octopus will often have a group of fish around it as it hunts. But it's just been assumed that these fish are following an octopus around to try and grab any prey animals that escape the octopus's clutches, that these fish are just hangers-on and they're not actually helping in any way. But now a team has gone out and recorded lots of video footage of these groups hunting, and they've analysed it in detail. And what they found is that some of the fish are actually actively helping the octopus to hunt. So these fish scout out potential prey and then they call the octopus to come and help flush these prey out of crevices that they can't reach themselves.
They call the octopus. What is that? How do they do that?
So when a fish sees something and it swims straight and fast towards one location, that's a sign to the others in the group, including the octopus, that it spotted something. Now you're going to go, well, of course, that's just the fish sort of hunting, it's not an actual signal to the others, and that might be correct. But what happens if that initial movement, that swimming straight and fast, if that's just ignored by the octopus, then the fish will start swimming back and forth between the potential prey it's found and the octopus to try and get the octopus's attention. And what's more, the octopus seems to understand that the fish is trying to get its attention and will often follow it back to that location.
Oh my gosh, that is amazing. But how do we know that the octopuses really are benefiting from this behavior?
So day octopuses hunt using this technique called a web over. They basically wrap themselves around rocks to try and trap any small animals that might be inside using the membrane between the tentacles. Basically, they bag themselves. They turn themselves into bags. Now, if they don't find anything, they will sort of unbag themselves and try again. If they do find something, they'll stay in position much longer while they catch and eat whatever it is that's inside the bag they've made. So when a day octopus is hunting alone, they do lots of web overs in quick succession. And these web overs don't usually last very long because they haven't caught anything. So this is called speculative hunting. They're basically not sure if anything's inside the rocks they're wrapping themselves around. They're just trying their luck. But what the team saw when a day octopus was hunting with fish, these octopus did far fewer web overs, but those web overs were much more likely to last longer. In other words, the octopuses seem to have a much better chance of catching things when they're hunting with the fish.
This is just blowing my mind a little bit. It's really, wow. And what about the punching? What's that about?
Yeah, the punching. So these groups of fish that hang around with the octopus, they consist of several different species, and those fish are not all equally cooperative and helpful. So there's a species called the blue goatfish, and the team found that these were the best at scouting out potential prey and really helped the octopus. And then there was another species called black-tip groupers that hardly ever helped at all. They were just hanging around, hoping to grab a bit of food without actually helping out. So the team filmed the octopus punching these blue goatfish away with their tentacles on just 3 occasions. But on 27 occasions, they recorded the octopus punching the black-tip groupers.
So they lash out?
Yeah, they lash out with their tentacles and actually sort of physically.
Yeah.
It's
That is wild.
Yeah.
So the octopus were hardly ever punching away the blue goatfish, but on lots of occasions they were punching the black-tip groupers. So that suggests that the octopus are actually understanding, hey, the blue goatfish are helping me, I'll be nice to them, and the black-tip groupers are just sort of parasites trying to sort of catch my prey, so I'm going to push them away.
So it is unusual, isn't it, for a solitary animal like this octopus to be able to interact positively with a different species, not even another octopus, you know?
Yeah, it's really surprising for a solitary animal to behave in this way and to be able to apparently understand these sort of social cues that these species are giving out. And of course, this is just one of many surprising discoveries we made about octopuses recently. For instance, there's a lot of evidence that octopuses dream, and they may even have nightmares about predators. So it's pretty amazing stuff. And I'm sure that there's lots more we still got to discover about them.
Next up, ancient cheese. When I saw that the world's oldest cheese had been found in China, I had to know more about it. And it turns out that some mummies at a burial site in Xinjiang in northwest China had smears of residue on the heads and necks. And those smears turned out to be cheese. 3,500-year-old cheesy goodness.
Yeah.
But before you ask, you can't eat it. You can't even smell it, which was my first question. It's just deteriorated so much. But analysis of the smears shows that there's the presence of proteins from ruminant milk and lactic acid bacteria and yeast, which suggests that these dairy remains are kefir cheese. Kefir is this traditional drink made by fermenting milk using kefir grains. And kefir grains are pellets of microbial cultures, so sort of like a sourdough starter.
Yeah, I made it once, and the starter, the grains, just started growing out of control.
Wow!
I had to get rid of it in the end. It really started. Have you ever grown any kefir or any fermented thing like that?
I have purchased some kefir at my local farmer's market. I thought it was pretty tasty. And then in an office I worked at, folks were passing around a SCOBY for kombucha so that everyone could have kombucha made from the same mother.
Ah, well, that's really interesting you mentioned that, because the thing that I found really interesting about this is like, fermentation is this ancient process that we've been doing. When I say we, I mean humans. The oldest example is a beer made 13,000 years ago that they found in what is now Israel. But the whole process is being modernized and repurposed in synthetic biology in some really cool ways.
So if we're talking about synthetic biology, then is this synthetic yeast?
Yeah, that's the project that maybe people have heard about. It's been going a long time, the idea to synthesize yeast, to be the first eukaryotic organism to be completely synthesized. And then the idea is if you could do that, you could then customize it to feed on oil spills or to make biofuel or to eat microplastics. We're going to hear about that later. And I visited a lab a couple of weeks ago where they're doing some of this stuff, but not with completely synthetic yeast, but by engineering organisms to do it.
Yeah, the last column you wrote for the magazine was about that, right?
Yeah. And while I was there, this was at the Bezos Centre for Sustainable Protein at Imperial College London. So they showed me loads of good projects. And one of them is kombucha. And you mentioned this SCOBY. SCOBY stands for Symbiotic Culture of Bacteria and Yeast. And what they're doing at Imperial, though, is to make a synthetic SCOBY using genetically engineered yeast cells and then a special kind of cellulose-producing bacteria and putting them together and calling it a SynSCOBY.
What did they want to do with the SynSCOBY?
Yeah, so I asked Tom Ellis about this. He's Professor of Synthetic Genome Engineering at Imperial. I asked him to tell us about this, and here he is.
So about 10 years ago, we were trying to isolate bacteria that produce materials because we're very interested in growing materials for our research. And we isolated a bacteria from kombucha that produced a cellulose hydrogel, which was really interesting to work with. And we worked out ways to do genetic engineering in that strain to get it to do modifications, get slightly different materials. But then we were thinking, how can we get it to do something even more interesting, like release therapeutics? And we realized that if you go back to kombucha, that bacteria lives naturally in symbiosis with other bacteria and yeasts. And so we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could create a synthetic symbiosis where we take lab yeasts that we can do all sorts of genetic engineering with and get them to live with these material-producing bacteria in something we called a SynSCOBY, so a synthetic version of the SCOBY. It was a really successful project. It meant that we could engineer yeast cells that are commonly used in biotech to do things like sense the environment and produce and secrete a therapeutic protein, but now we can grow them as part of a material of cellulose so that we can have these kind of living materials that are producing therapeutic proteins in response to inputs. So it's a really interesting way we can use symbiosis of microbes to make a therapeutic product.
Wow, I did not expect to go from ancient cheese to living materials.
I know, right? It's really exciting stuff, and I'm sure we'll report it on again in the future.
Next up, life in plastic. It seems like every few months we're finding microplastics in some new part of the body, from our livers and kidneys to our guts and lungs. Just last week, a study found microplastics in people's olfactory bulb, a brain structure that's crucial to our sense of smell.
Ew.
But what is all that plastic actually doing to us? Here to discuss the potential health consequences of microplastics is health reporter Grace Wade. Hi, Grace.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So first, let's do a little recap about microplastics and just how they're getting into all of our organs.
Yeah, so microplastics are plastic fragments that are so small, they're less than 5 millimeters in size, that they can make their way into our bodies through food, water, and even the air we breathe. And they form when larger pieces of plastic, such as car tires or food packaging, are broken down by sunlight, water, or other forces. Manufacturers also purposely add microplastics to certain skincare products and cosmetics. Think exfoliating beads or glitter.
Okay, that part isn't actually too surprising because I know that once you spill glitter, you can never get rid of it. But seriously, how worried should we be about these microplastics in our bodies? Because to me, it sounds pretty alarming.
I would say that we don't need to lose sleep over microplastics, at least not yet. A recent review of 2 decades worth of microplastic research found limited evidence that these particles harm human health, and that is because we just don't have enough research on how they affect people.
Do we have any clues, at least?
So far, the most compelling evidence comes from a study published earlier this year, which examined artery plaques removed from 257 adults. And it found microplastics in 151 of them. When the researchers followed up with participants 34 months later, they found that those who had microplastics in their artery plaques were 4 times as likely to die or have a heart attack or stroke as those who did not.
But that makes me think I should lose sleep over it. I mean, does that mean that microplastics might increase the risk of cardiovascular disease or stroke?
Potentially, but also it's possible that other factors could be underlying this association. For instance, people whose plaques contain microplastics may be exposed to air pollution more than those whose plaques didn't. And air pollution, in addition to containing microplastics, also raises the risk of heart disease.
Okay, so there's a link here, but we're just not positive that microplastics are to blame. And is that it, or are there other potential health effects?
So studies conducted in rodents have suggested that microplastics can have detrimental effects on their digestive, reproductive, and respiratory systems. But most of these studies use unrealistically high amounts of microplastics, which makes it really hard to translate the findings to people. Microplastics also come in a whole range of shapes, sizes, and materials, each of which may have distinct health effects. But the majority of studies only look at 2 common types of plastics and use round plastic particles. All of these limitations make it impossible to understand how microplastics may be affecting our health.
So I guess in this case, ignorance is bliss?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I take from it. But that's also why I said most people don't need to lose sleep over the issue. However, we shouldn't assume microplastics are harmless until we have more data. Since these particles are incredibly difficult to remove, it is important that governments and producers work to reduce plastic production and prevent plastics from polluting the environment.
Well, I'll do my part by avoiding glitter spills.
Same.
That's all for this week. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for listening.
Please tell your friends about us and give us a 5-star rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
And there's always more from New Scientist on our website at newscientist.com. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.